I'm going to introduce the first presenter of today, which is Mark Henderson from the Faculty of Health, looking at volunteer mentors and the agency uncovered in empathy. So I'd like to welcome Mark up to start his presentation.
Alison.
Thank you very much.
Do I have a clicker or anything like that? That's forward, that's back. Yep. I'll figure it out. And how's the sound like that? Not good? It is good? It's okay. I just plant this sucker on my chin and that's how I work it. Pretty much. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Henderson. I'm a social science researcher in the Faculty of Health. I started in the Faculty of Social Science. Today I'm going to talk about volunteer mentors and the agency they uncover in empathy. So I'm a doctorate student. Last time I was here I was a master's student, but I've sort of taken a step up. I got published a couple of times, which was good. Satisfying. More so, you should probably be clapping my academic supervisors, so Professor Mark Hughes, Dr. Gregory Smith, and Professor John Hurley. I'm just the guy sort of doing the grunt work. So, so I'd like to also just recognise that elders past and present and emerging. I started my study on Gambangia land, which is around the Coffs Harbour region. I now work on Awakabal country, which is Newcastle, where I just moved to. The land always is and always will be. The stories are as well, and I need to acknowledge stories when I talk about mentoring, because mentors occasionally tell stories. They tell personal stories. They show their vulnerability. They get around a group in a circle and they talk at times. And there's all this knowledge contained in Indigenous language and Indigenous understanding. And I'd just like to acknowledge that as well. Oops, that's going to go too fast. So I've been researching the lived experience of voluntary male mentors. Basically, I had been involved in mentoring, not a program as such. I joined a group of men at a certain time in my life, and we would sit around a table and talk. These guys were generally a generation or two older than myself, and along the way, another man in another region wanted to get mentoring going. His mentor had passed away, and he looked around. What's going on in Australia? He couldn't find it. So then he found the own group, which was this small group of old fellas in Coffs Harbour. And he said, what do I do? He actually had a board. He'd been quite a senior manager. He was this sort of really organised, dynamic, energetic guy, but didn't know what to do, not a theorist at all. And they sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, go give this guy a hand. Would you, Mark? Because I was sort of a bit younger and had a bit of energy in some ways. So I did that and built a facilitation workshop, which is largely based on Rogerian work. So Carl Rogers was a really important psychologist, and he basically listens. He says, as a therapist, you listen, and you don't direct, and you don't necessarily advise. The restorative process is in the listening. And that's kind of what I taught these guys. It was like teaching them a bit about empathy. And that carried on. After a while, I hit some questions, and that's how I ended up here, frankly, that curiosity. So yes, I'll talk a little bit about, I suppose, that youth, angry youth maybe. There's kind of a Greek god involved along the way in terms of the history of mentoring. There's a king, there's a coming together of people, and there's that individuality and curiosity that comes in there as well. So voluntary mentoring, where it came from was there was this playwright called Homer. He wrote about the Trojan Wars in the Iliad. You'd be familiar with that. He also then wrote another book called The Odyssey. And the Odysseus was about King Odyssey from Ithaca. And he'd gone and fought in the Trojan Wars, and he hadn't returned for 10 years. And his kingdom was falling into disrepair. He had a wife who sort of knitted this thing during the day, then unpicked it at night, because once it was completed, she had to marry one of the many suitors. And she had a son who was about 15, 16, called Telemachus. And obviously, once the mother married this person would become the king and would quickly dispatch and murder the son. And the son knew this, it was all obvious. So then Athena presented in this chieftain from down the way who'd come for some festival, and the chieftain said, I knew your father Odysseus, and he asked me to look in on you. And that was the first character called mentor. But actually Athena emanated in this body, embodied this person, and said, go and find your father. Hang out here, you're dead. It's just a matter of time. Go find your father. And Telemachus went on this journey. So it was a subplot in this book. And Telemachus was the mentee, and this guy called the mentor went along. But the key thing in this was Telemachus was the prince. So he was senior. It wasn't the mentor who was the senior person. The senior person, through birth, was the prince. And the mentor could only really advise. But the advice wasn't the direction. They weren't telling him what to do. Telemachus had authority, if you want. Anyway, the sub-theme was picked up by a writer called Fenelon in 1699. And, well, actually before that, but he died in 1699. And the book, The Journey of Telemachus, became the most popular book in Europe by 1750. And it was a rewrite of that subplot. And you had this mentor helping this young person. Then what happened is we went well forward to Levinson, Professor Levinson, who did this great big study. It went for years. They interviewed 40 men. 10 were biology professors who had tenureship. 10 of them were published authors. They published at least twice. 10 of them were middle to senior managers. 10 of them were what you'd call a blue-collar worker of some sort. And they were looking for this particular thing. They were looking for the structures that support a person in their life. And like really great research, well, they didn't find it. They didn't have a eureka moment, but they did have a moment where they went, oh, that's weird, what's going on? Which is really great research. And what they found was that people develop in a structured way in their life. It's an age-related process. So like in early psychology, you might have the different stages that Freud picked up. They picked up that you have these different stages and they're quite age-related in your life. Sure, they might have slightly changed or stretched as we live a bit longer, and they're not related to the events of your life. Jobs, births, deaths, buying houses, all that stuff. It's not related to that. And we're all going through this. We all have these structures. And you have these structures where you have your child and adolescence, early adult transition. These 5-year transitions, they overlap. Another midlife transition, a late transition. And these guys, Levinson identified, they didn't say that, they grabbed this word called mentoring. They reached back and grabbed this word and said, what happens is to complete these transitions well, to complete them properly, you need to be involved in mentorship. It's a helpful thing for you. But it's not just being a mentee, it's also being a mentor at a certain stage in your life. It helps you consolidate your knowledge. Now, my research is looking at the mentors and what their experience is, not the mentees. So I went and interviewed these guys. I've gone back and interviewed them again, which has been really good as a PhD researcher to get deeper information. But they made it pretty clear. They said, connect through listening. Connection is the core of the whole thing. They listen really intently. They authentically listen to people. They clear their mind, they're present, they're here, and they pay attention to the person in front of them. Being real. They're going to be straight up. They're not going to play stories. And that's the beautiful thing about voluntary mentoring. You see, when you do the mentoring in an organisation, there's an end that you're after. So an academic wants you to get published. Your professors will get published, right? A business wants to get you to stick around and not leave. They want you to get technical knowledge. They want you to learn how we do it around here. Educational mentoring, really important one. But there's still an end to it in keeping you there and learning this. In voluntary mentoring, there's that part where the volunteer mentors, they care for you, but it's your life. You want to go screw it up? Screw it up. A bit. I mean, obviously they'd be disappointed, but that's the way it goes. Right? So they're sort of not, they care as a verb if you want, but they're not necessarily invested. They'll tell you how it is. You know, a really important relationship would be a parental relationship in a person's life. Really important, obviously, right? There's no debates about that. Mentoring is another important relationship. There's a difference in the two. The mentor isn't hugely invested in you, necessarily. That's the kind of reality to it, which goes on. But the other thing that happened with these guys is empathy grew. This is for the mentors. They got this empathic awareness. They started being aware of other people's life. Their scope expands. And this is a buzz. They actually use things like the words, it's a buzz. So they felt opened up, energized, calmer. They developed confidence. And developing of confidence is really interesting because confidence is kind of agency. It's your ability to have what you want to happen in your life. Everyone here has shown agency to get here. Confidence is really important to your efficacy in the world, to be able to do things, and that is linked to agency. And agency is your ability to function, to do things in the world that you want to happen. How do you get there? How does it happen? Well, you're all here. You've got the agency to be here now. Well done. Well done. See, here's two guys, they're hanging out together. They're not judging, they're not telling each other what to do, they're just doing it. And these guys typically meet with another person for about 1 hour a week. They need to show up. They need to show up. They say things like, their experience is so different to mine. I don't know their experiences, so I can never be fully empathetic, but I'll try. At least I'll try to get into their zone. And it's interesting, empathy. We're going to talk about it. So what's empathy? So there's been psychology studies that try to measure these things. They say, oh, we think it's this and we think it's that. And they found no discernible difference. So they said, well, maybe we didn't. It's hard to measure. So someone else went and looked at 14,000 published articles with empathy written in it. Because we all go, yeah, empathy, I'm empathetic, or you have some empathy. I looked at 14,000 published articles. They got it down to 22 definitions. They then gleaned it down to 4 definitions. And they got something along the lines of, well, they didn't. They said that the words that you're using in empathy to describe it are more complex than the word empathy, a multi-dimensional relatability of understanding to people's perspective. Sure, there's perspective taking. Right? There's trying to get into other person's feelings. There's even compassion. But ultimately, it remained a notoriously tricky construct with a semantic fuzziness as a dynamic unfolding process of imaginatively experiencing others' subjective consciousness. It just doesn't quite make sense. So you get down to these core ideas, and the core ideas is you care, you relate, you share feelings, and at least you try to understand. Really practical stuff. So men who identify as life or voluntary mentors with no explicit therapeutic training, right? Electricians, managers, whatever, engage others for the contribution and satisfaction they experience. Pretty average sort of guys. I know that in this day and age we're all online and awesome. Every single one of us. Yes, we are independent. We are original. Life is messy. But we're just people. And they say things like, I could be saying to the guy, go and do X, Y, and Z, but I don't say it. Advice giving is not listening. And that's really clear. And one of the things that makes you less effective is if you try to fix the other person's problems. And it's really great because you're a mentor, right? And you're not going to sort the other person out. You're not actually invested in them. You care, you'll show up, you'll listen. And then when you're about to say, oh, I reckon you should do this, you shut up and you listen to some more. And this is restorative. For the mentee and for the mentor, it's somewhat expansive and they contribute. So voluntary mentoring, they talk about a shift in their awareness. Something shifted, right? They hung out with the person who they normally wouldn't have hung out with for maybe 1 hour a week for 6 months. So I mentioned about these development periods. So you can keep gleaning down different levels of them. But the idea is that during your the transition periods, the early adult transition, the midlife transition, the late adult transition, really great if you can find a mentor. Really good. And this is mainly men, but these guys did similar research and it was for women too. Some life events can stretch things out and shift things a little bit more, but basically that's the way it goes. But during the other bits, the early adulthood and middle adulthood particularly, be a mentor. And if we can get this all going on, people are going to feel held. They feel this psychosocial support is one way, which is a bit of a wobbly word to me as well. It's the idea that someone's got my back. If I can go and talk to someone each week, they also get feedback, these mentors, all the time. They sit there and they'll be seeing a mentee and the mentee will say, oh, I go and see a counsellor as well, but I prefer hanging out with you because you're not getting paid. You're here because you want to be here. That's the magic of the volunteering. That's the little fairy dust that comes down into it all. Right? The person just wants to be there. They go, I'm part of humanity. You're part of humanity. I can care for you. You're a human being. What the heck? And they show up. And that type of pro-social behaviour, I might add, that type of pro-social behaviour, people go, oh, I don't have time for it. Well, there's a really good paper on pro-social behaviour. The pro-social behaviour gives you time. It gives you time. If you want to look at your time in a diary, and hey, I don't know, I expect you're the same. Your diaries are full. Your time's taken up. All this study you're going to do, but you're staring into space. I don't know. But what happens is when you're pro-social, it's like it becomes elastic, your time. Because those moments where they have more meaning, where you're doing something for other people, you're giving service, it stretches your time and you value your time differently. So it gives you time. You're not watching the reruns of whatever you're watching the reruns of. You're spending that time studying, you're valuing your time differently. So on a linear thing in your diary, your watch, of course it takes up time. But in your subjective experience of time, volunteering, being pro-social, can give you time. So where are we at? I might, actually, I'm just going to flick back there. So what happened is these guys found that they really enjoyed doing this mentoring. They listened, they looked for perspectives, they were curious, they offered the protection of an equal confident. It becomes 360, the whole mentoring thing. Let's face it, even you're dealing with a person who's quite distressed, a whole lot younger than you, not as much life experience, they still have their life experiences. They still have their insights in one way. Our children teach us stuff, right? Empathy emerged and agency to form relationships. These guys, some of these men go out there and say, I'm at a barbecue, I don't care, I'll talk to whoever I feel like. And if the person wants to sit there and go on about something irrelevant, well, I'll probe in there. But if they're still going to go on about how big their car is, I'll excuse myself. They're okay, they'll do that. But if they do get to the point where the person starts wanting to talk about actually how where they're positioned, and they're feeling where there's something going on for them, they're available. Doesn't mean they're going to go on forever. It doesn't mean they're going to have a great big long relationship with this person, but they do find that people come to them with stuff over time. They give this presentation of it, and they like that. They say things like, "If I didn't have mentoring in my life, I'd be looking to replace it." That's really came through quite commonly. So they do recognise they're creating ripples in their communities. They think they're contributing to something. They talked about their unexpected shifts, and caring and trust emerge, and we can all do with a bit more caring and trust, can't we? So they did think it made them kind of a better person at times being involved in this, but it definitely gave them another aspect to their life, these guys. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Does anyone have any questions for Mark before we let him go?
Just a comment, really. I guess if we go back to the communication style, is it that women do that in their friendships?
Like be empathetic and listening. And there's